You are listening to the New Book of Daniel podcast. This is a special show to talk about the extraordinary legislative session in Idaho called by Governor Brad Little that will happen on Monday, August 24th. Idaho is supposed to have three separate but equal branches of government. But the way Idaho's governor is running things, he's acting more like a dictator. Normally you expect to hear that from a governor that has a D after his or her name, but strangely, this guy has an R after his. Joining me to talk about this is Miste Karlfeldt, Director of Health Freedom Idaho, in this special edition of the New Book of Daniel podcast. Hello and welcome to the New Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski and I'll be your host on this adventure. Today I have a very special edition of our show. We have kind of an emergency happening here in Idaho. We have a legislative session being called by the governor to kind of ramrod through some legislation that he wants passed that he actually wrote and sent to the cronies in the legislature to ram through. That's the way it's being described to me, and that's the way it sounds to me. That's the way it reads to me. Today we have a special guest, Miste Karlfeldt, to talk about it. Let's go straight to our conversation with Miste. Well, Miste, I want to thank you so much for joining me on this short notice. We have a kind of a legislative crisis happening here in Idaho, and I know you've been on top of it more than I have. So I wanted to connect with you, and I thank you for coming on, and welcome to the show.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to do what I can to get the word out so that people will get there on Monday.
So for those that don't know, I wrote a column last week or two on the governor calling for special immunity, which kind of caused a stir, not just in the nation, but especially here in the state, and got a lot of attention. And now we're down to the wire, and there's been some changes made. What can you tell us so far of what you know regarding this special legislative session?
Well, I don't know if you saw that we tried to have a special session for the people because the people want the state of emergency to end, and that did not happen. So now the governor, I think his answer to that was to create these task forces to discuss whether or not they should have a special session. And so what has been created from that is a special session that is not for the people and 100% the government protecting the government. So that's what we have ahead of us tomorrow.
And it's kind of scary when you take a look at what this is going to do if it passes. And there's several circumstances regarding how they're conducting this session that are also scary. Let's hopefully get to that in this brief time we have. Heather Scott is a representative here in Idaho from District 1. And she did a video that came out yesterday where she was talking about this. She's been on a committee, one of those committees that you're talking about, these task force committees, and they were given legislation to look at. They were not allowed to change the language. They weren't allowed to go outside the boundaries of these special working groups were given for things that they wanted to address. They had to stay in the lanes, was her phrase. They weren't allowed to make amendments. And interestingly, the governor, by constitution, is allowed to pick the subjects for the special session, but he also went so far as to put in his own language into the bills that he wanted these guys to address. Is that how you understand it?
That is how I understand it. And what's really disgusting about that is by silencing the legislature, you're silencing the voice of the people because they are the voice of the people. So they can't have a say or debate or discuss what is on the minds of the citizens that they represent.
And that's scary that we have a governor who's just saying, I'm going to tell you what you can talk about and you can't talk about anything else. How is that even representative? It seems more like something I would expect out of Russia,
right,
or Venezuela.
Absolutely. He seems to be isolating the executive branch by silencing the legislative branch, not having the legislative branch oversee the spending of the CARES Act money, which is their function, right, to create the budget and oversee the spending. He's shut them out of that, and now he wants to create immunity to liability, which effectively shuts out the judicial branch and leaves the people without any recourse through the judicial branch. So he's definitely separating himself as the executive branch, and that's why people are calling him a tyrant
Mhm.
or king, because he is behaving as such.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Here's what Heather Scott read, this legislative intent, and I'm quoting what she read. The intent of this legislation is to limit the liability by providing a safe harbor to all persons during a disaster and emergency arising from COVID pandemic or epidemic who, in good faith efforts, meet the requirements occasioned by such an event. And so the way that she was explaining it and other people have been explaining it is, let's say that I own a small retail store and the government has mandated masks. And I decide not to make masks a requirement to enter my store. And then someone enters my store, I'm not requiring a mask, and they shop in my store, and the next day or two, they find out that they've caught COVID. Then they decide to sue me because I didn't require a mask. What this legislation is saying is that if I had required masks, if I had met the requirements occasioned by the event, then I would have immunity. But because I didn't require masks, then I'd be liable to pay for this person's medical damages.
Right.
Is
Right.
that how you understand it?
That's how I understand it. So it's compelling behavior of businesses through the executive branch, right? So now not only do we not have our legislature speaking for us, we don't have access to the judicial branch, we have businesses doing the bidding of the executive branch, or else they're open to liability. And who doesn't want protection from liability, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the other side of that is even the treatment for COVID. For example, hydroxychloroquine, like the big bad buzzword. Our governor put a unilateral halt on any prescription of hydroxychloroquine that was not on label. For a time, people were not able to receive hydroxychloroquine from their doctor for application to COVID. And so my question was, how many people died because of that in Idaho? So we could then extrapolate that to a hospital now, because they're saying that the hospitals are going to have this immunity. So if you go to a hospital and you demand hydroxychloroquine, and the hospital saying, well, we don't have to give it, we're immune from your lawsuit. Is that also applying?
Right, right. And isn't that practicing medicine without a license by the governor? I would really like an attorney's opinion on that. I'd like to see some lawsuits if that's the case, but it sounds to me like it's practicing medicine without a license. And how dare he withhold any treatment from any Idahoan? It is not his place.
When you have doctors who prescribe things off label all the time, you think that they're trained professionals, they would know what they're doing, but he just put a blanket halt on it. It makes no sense. I think you're absolutely right. There needs to be an investigation. And by the way, I did find out from the governor's press secretary that he has been named in some lawsuits related to COVID on multiple levels. So one must wonder if he's seeking immunity so he doesn't get sued from these lawsuits.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, nobody wants to be busted for having their hand in the cookie jar.
So something else that crossed my desk was that they're trying to push this legislation through in a day. How is that possible? Normally a bill is supposed to be able to be read on the floor of the House, and then the public is supposed to have time to review the bill. Could you explain how that's supposed to work for us?
Well, I mean, you're supposed to have an RS, which is a routing slip. And I say supposed to because this is the way it normally goes. And then I'll tell you like the backdoor way they shove things through. And this is how it would make sense for the public to have access to what is happening really to them as far as the laws taking place in Idaho. So there's a routing slip, which is an RS. So then you have in front of the committee a hearing for that routing slip. And that's a print hearing. And so then the committee can say, well, why don't you go back and make these changes and then we'll discuss it. Or they can say, yeah, that's worthy of at least discussing. So then they'll say, okay, send it to print. So then it gets a bill number and then it has another hearing and the people have 24-hour notice because they are supposed to have 24-hour notice before a hearing. So then that gives the public 24 hours to review the bill. And same with the legislators. They need time to comb over that bill. That's not, you can't be educated on all things, on all bills all the time. And the fact that they have to quite often make those decisions and ask those questions in 24 hours is just wild. You know, legislative session is a wild time. So with this one, and how the speaker can do it when he wants to ram things through, is go through the Ways and Means Committee. And that's what I'm hearing that he might do, is ram it through the Ways and Means Committee and get it done all in one day. And I mean, this is like way too big and important to not give it its due time and its due process, and let the legislators really have time to look it over, and let the citizens really have time to investigate it and come together and have a real meeting of the minds. But you can see over and over, the example is, we don't want to hear from the legislature. We don't want to hear from the people. We want a top-down decision about this liability, this immunity from liability.
These are very, as you said, top-down orders that are coming from the executive branch through committee chairs in the legislature. Is that correct?
Right.
And so we have people, as it has been described to me, some of these chairs and these committee chairs and speakers, whoever you want to say, are in the pocket of the governor.
Right.
It would seem counterintuitive to me. If I was a representative, wouldn't I want to represent the people instead of trying to push through the governor's agenda, unless there was something in it for them?
Oh, certainly.
You know, I look at what's happening in our state, and since our governor very much surprised me, by the way, when he declared the emergency. But then when I found out he had $1.2 billion at his disposal, you can buy a lot of influence with $1.2 billion. You can win a lot of friends and influence a lot of people with $1.2 billion.
Right.
And my understanding is one of the lawsuits against him is how he's been spending the money that has come to the state.
Good, it should be.
So I also heard that one of the towns near us, Kuna, that they're using CARES, maybe you haven't heard of this, but they're using CARES money to hire tutors. Did you hear about that?
I did.
Well, can you elaborate? I didn't catch all the details.
You know, I skimmed that article and I was so disgusted, I couldn't actually completely take it in. My understanding is that they're saying to keep their government employees' children safe, that they should have sort of this special school. So it sounds pretty elitist to me.
Like some animals are more equal than others?
Right.
Yeah, this is sounding more and more like Soviet Russia than anything else I've ever seen. I've heard it talked about in several conversations that either somebody has dirt on the governor, or somebody has threatened the governor, or somebody's bribing the governor. That one of those three has to be happening for him to make such a Jekyll and Hyde switch, since $1.2+ billion floated across his desk. I'm not making any accusations. I'm telling you what I've heard. Those are the three things that people are floating around as the reason for this switch. I wanted to wrap up by quoting a little bit from Wayne Hoffman. He's the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and he published a piece here past couple of days. He said, does a good faith effort, which is this whole rationalization for this immunity bill, does a good faith effort mean strict enforcement for mask wearing policies such that no one is exempt? Does it require employees to forcibly remove mask scofflaws from premises? One thing is certain, if this legislation becomes law, expect more confrontations between employees and customers, because now there is a prize. Lawsuit immunity is on the line. There's supposed to be three co-equal branches of government. Right now, in my opinion, they're not.
Not at all. Not at all.
So, all right. Well, let's hope that this gets squashed in our session this week here in Idaho, and to other people in other states. Let's hope that this doesn't spill over. This is kind of a dangerous precedent-setting thing if it happens, and it's a one slippery slope into a Marxist, communist kind of top-down dictatorship. So anyways, Misty, I want to thank you for taking a time out of your day on short notice to meet with me. And we'll have to have you back on to talk more about vaccines, because I think that's going to be an issue in the near future as well.
Absolutely. And I'm praying for extraordinary bravery tomorrow, and I hope other people will pray for that as well. Extraordinary bravery by our brave legislators who love freedom at the Capitol tomorrow. You never know what God can do, and I believe in miracles, so it's to be seen.
Amen to that. Amen. Thank you, Misty.
Friend.
Well, my big concern in all of this is that if Idaho passes this legislation, this is going to set precedent for many other states. People look to Idaho as a red state, and normally it is, but lately our governor has been acting like a Jekyll Hyde kind of guy, which is kind of scary. You can contact your legislators in the states. You can contact your legislators wherever you live and tell them you don't want this kind of stuff happening. This is not what our government is supposed to be about. I would encourage you also to subscribe to our podcast. That way you're going to get updates on what's happening. We'll stay abreast of this conversation. You can also send me an email. Just simply use newbookofdaniel@outlook.com. newbookofdaniel@outlook.com. You can also follow me on Facebook. Simply facebook.com/newbookofdaniel. I'm also on Twitter and Parler as @newbookofdaniel. And of course, I blog once in a while over at the newbookofdaniel.com blog, newbookofdaniel.com. And you can follow my writings on political stuff and issues of the day at uncoverdc.com and Red State. My name is Daniel Bobinski. You've been listening to the New Book of Daniel podcast. I thank you for listening. Until the next time, be blessed.